Dennis Rader was an American serial killer who terrorized Wichita, Kansas for over 30 years, murdering 10 innocent people between 1974 and 1991 while leading a seemingly normal life as a husband, father, church leader, and community member, earning his nickname BTK, which stood for his twisted method of bind, torture, kill. On a cold January morning in 1974, the residents of Wichita, Kansas had no idea that a monster had awakened in their midst. Dennis Rader, a seemingly ordinary 28-year-old man, was about to embark on a killing spree that would haunt the city for over 3 decades. What made his crimes particularly chilling was not just their brutality, but the fact that the man responsible lived among them as a respected member of the community, hiding his dark desires behind a mask of normalcy that fooled everyone who knew him. Born on March 9th, 1945, in the small town of Pittsburgh, Kansas, Dennis Rader came into the world during the final months of World War II. His parents, William Elvin Rader and Dorothea May Cook, were devout Lutherans who raised their 4 sons in what appeared to be a stable, church-going household. William worked as a utility worker for Kansas Gas and Electric Company, while Dorothea was a devoted homemaker who instilled strong religious values in her children. The family moved to Wichita when Dennis was still young, settling into a modest home in what would become the hunting ground for one of America's most notorious serial killers. From the outside, the Rader household seemed like any other middle-class American family of the 1950s. They attended Zion Lutheran Church regularly, participated in community events, and maintained a respectable reputation among their neighbors. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy, young Dennis was developing disturbing patterns of behavior that would later manifest in horrific ways. Even as a child, he displayed troubling signs that should have served as warning signals of the darkness growing within him. By his own later admission, Dennis Rader began experiencing violent sexual fantasies involving bondage and torture while still in elementary school. These fantasies initially focused on imaginary victims, but as he grew older, they became more specific and detailed. He would spend hours drawing pictures of women bound and gagged, creating elaborate scenarios in his mind where he held complete power over helpless victims. These drawings, which he kept hidden from his family, showed a disturbing level of detail and planning that revealed the calculating nature of his developing psyche. One of the most disturbing aspects of Rader's childhood was his treatment of animals. While many children might occasionally be rough with pets or show curiosity about animal anatomy, Rader's behavior went far beyond normal childhood exploration. He would systematically torture small animals, hanging cats and dogs in various ways to watch them struggle and die. This behavior, known as the graduation hypothesis in criminal psychology, often serves as a precursor to violence against humans. For Dennis Rader, it was both a rehearsal and a way to satisfy his growing need for control and domination. Despite these troubling behaviors, Rader managed to maintain an outward appearance of normalcy throughout his school years. He was an average student who participated in Boy Scouts, where he learned many of the knot-tying skills that would later become his signature at crime scenes. His fellow scouts remembered him as quiet but capable, someone who followed instructions well and seemed eager to please authority figures. This pattern of seeking approval from those in positions of power would continue throughout his life, as he desperately craved recognition and validation for his perceived accomplishments. During his teenage years at Wichita Heights High School, Rader's fantasies continued to evolve and intensify. He spent countless hours alone in his room, developing elaborate scenarios involving captive women whom he would bind, torture, and ultimately kill. These fantasies became so consuming that they began to interfere with his ability to form normal relationships with peers. While other teenagers were dating and socializing, Rader retreated deeper into his imaginary world, where he held absolute power over his victims. His high school yearbook photo from 1963 shows a clean-cut young man with a slightly forced smile, giving no hint of the darkness lurking behind his eyes. His classmates would later remember him as unremarkable, someone who blended into the background and rarely drew attention to himself. This ability to remain invisible, to appear completely ordinary, would serve him well in the years to come as he began to act out his murderous fantasies in the real world. After graduating from high school in 1963, Rader seemed uncertain about his future direction. He briefly attended Kansas Wesleyan University, but struggled academically and socially. The structure of college life did not suit his particular psychological needs, and he found it difficult to concentrate on his studies while his violent fantasies continued to intensify. After dropping out of college, he worked a series of temporary jobs, never staying in one place long enough to form meaningful connections with coworkers or establish himself in any particular field. In August 1966, seeking structure and perhaps hoping to channel his darker impulses in a more socially acceptable direction, Rader enlisted in the United States Air Force. The military provided exactly what he needed at that point in his life: clear hierarchies, strict rules, and defined expectations. For someone who craved control but also needed external structure to function, the Air Force offered an ideal environment. He served as a mechanic, working on aircraft systems with the same methodical attention to detail that he applied to his violent fantasies. During his 4 years of military service, Rader was stationed at various bases across the United States and overseas, including locations in Alabama, Japan, Korea, Turkey, and Greece. His military records show that he was a model airman who followed orders without question and never caused disciplinary problems. He earned the Air Force Good Conduct Medal, the Small Arms Expert Marksmanship Ribbon, and the National Defense Service Medal, achieving the rank of sergeant before his honorable discharge in 1970. The military experience was significant for Rader in several ways. First, it provided him with technical skills and knowledge about systems and equipment that he would later use in his crimes. More importantly, it gave him a sense of accomplishment and recognition that he had never experienced before. For someone with his psychological makeup, the military's emphasis on hierarchy, discipline, and following orders appealed to both his need for control and his desire to be part of something larger than himself. However, military service did not cure Rader of his violent fantasies. If anything, the discipline and structure he experienced during the day seemed to intensify his private thoughts during his off-duty hours. He continued to draw disturbing pictures and develop elaborate scenarios involving captive women. The weapons training he received in the Air Force also provided him with knowledge about firearms and other tools that could be used to subdue victims. When Rader returned to civilian life in 1970, he faced the challenge of finding his place in a world that lacked the clear structure of military service. He moved back to the Wichita area and began searching for both employment and a sense of purpose. It was during this transitional period that he met Paula Dietz, a young woman from a religious background similar to his own. Paula was everything that Rader felt he needed: attractive, devout, and seemingly naive about the darker aspects of human nature. Paula Dietz had been raised in a stable, religious family, where her father worked as an engineer and her mother served as a librarian. She attended Kansas Wesleyan University, where she studied accounting and graduated in 1970. She was active in her Lutheran church and participated in various community activities. When she met Dennis Rader at a church function, she saw a clean-cut former serviceman who appeared to share her values and interests. Their courtship followed traditional patterns of the early 1970s. Rader was charming and attentive, playing the role of the perfect boyfriend with the same methodical approach he applied to everything else in his life. He understood that marriage would provide him with the perfect cover for his true nature. A married man with a respectable job and community connections would be far less likely to attract suspicion when people began disappearing or turning up dead. On May 22, 1971, Dennis Rader and Paula Dietz were married in a traditional Lutheran ceremony. To all who attended, they appeared to be a perfect match. Two young people from similar backgrounds, starting their life together with the blessing of their families and their church. Paula had no idea that she was marrying someone who spent his private hours fantasizing about torture and murder. The man she fell in love with was essentially a carefully constructed persona designed to hide the monster lurking beneath. After their marriage, the couple settled into a modest home in Park City, a suburb just north of Wichita. Rader found work at the Coleman Company, a manufacturer of outdoor equipment and camping gear. This job provided him with steady income and, more importantly, access to tools and materials that could be useful for his future crimes. The company manufactured ropes, knives, and other equipment that Rader began mentally cataloging for potential use in his violent fantasies. For the first few years of their marriage, Rader seemed to be living a genuinely normal life. He worked steadily, attended church with his wife, and participated in community activities. However, Beneath this facade of normalcy, his violent fantasies were becoming more intense and specific. He began what he would later call his trolling activities, driving around Wichita and the surrounding areas to identify potential victims and study their daily routines. In November 1973, Paula gave birth to their first child, a son they named Brian. Becoming a father should have been a transformative experience for Rader, providing him with new responsibilities and a greater sense of connection to conventional family life. Instead, the additional stress and responsibility of parenthood seemed to push him closer to acting out his violent fantasies. The demands of caring for an infant disrupted his carefully structured routine and left him feeling increasingly frustrated and powerless in his daily life. Just 6 weeks after his son's birth, on January 15, 1974, Dennis Rader crossed the line from fantasy to reality. He had been watching the Otero family for several weeks, studying their routines and planning his attack with the same methodical approach he applied to everything else in his life. Joseph Otero, a 38-year-old Air Force veteran, lived with his wife Julie, 34, and their 5 children in a modest home on Edgemore Street in Wichita. Unknown to the family, they had become the focus of a predator's attention. That morning, Rader prepared what he called his hit kit, a collection of tools and restraints he had assembled for this moment. The kit included rope, tape, plastic bags, knives, and a gun. He drove to the Otero home and waited outside until he saw the older children leave for school, leaving only the parents and 2 younger children at home. Then he approached the house and cut the phone lines before entering through an unlocked door. When Joseph and Julie Otero discovered an intruder in their home, Rader told them he was a wanted man from California who needed their car and some food. He assured them that if they cooperated, no one would be hurt. This was a lie designed to keep them calm while he gained control of the situation. Using techniques he had developed during years of fantasy, he systematically bound each family member with rope and tape. However, once Rader had the family completely under his control, his true intentions became clear. This was not a robbery or a kidnapping for money. This was the culmination of years of violent sexual fantasies, and the Oteros were about to become the first victims of his twisted desires. What followed was a scene of unspeakable horror that would haunt the Wichita community for decades. Rader began by strangling Joseph Otero, using a rope around his neck, while the man's wife and children watched in terror. When Julie Otero begged for her family's lives, Rader turned his attention to her, placing a plastic bag over her head and strangling her with rope. The 2 younger children, 11-year-old Josephine and 9-year-old Joseph Jr., were forced to witness their parents' deaths before becoming victims themselves. Young Joseph was strangled with rope in a bedroom, his small body no match for Rader's methodical brutality. Josephine, however, was saved for last in a display of particular cruelty. Rader hanged the 11-year-old girl from a pipe in the basement, positioning her body in a sexually suggestive pose before photographing the scene. After all 4 family members were dead, he masturbated over Josephine's body, achieving the sexual release that had been the ultimate goal of his fantasy. Before leaving the Otero home, Rader spent time collecting souvenirs from his victims. He took Joseph's watch, some jewelry belonging to Julie, and most disturbingly, a pair of Josephine's underwear. These items would become part of his private collection of trophies, physical reminders of his crimes that he could use to relive the experience during future fantasy sessions. When the 3 surviving Otero children returned from school that afternoon, they found their families' bodies and called the police. The scene that greeted investigators was unlike anything they had encountered before. This was not a burglary gone wrong or a crime of passion. The methodical nature of the killings, the evidence of sexual activity, and the way the victims had been positioned suggested a perpetrator with very specific psychological motivations. The Wichita Police Department found themselves facing a case that challenged everything they thought they knew about criminal behavior. The killer had clearly spent considerable time at the scene after the murders, arranging bodies and taking photographs. He had shown no signs of panic or haste, working with the calm efficiency of someone who had planned every detail in advance. Most disturbing of all, he had apparently achieved sexual gratification from the act of killing, suggesting that he would almost certainly kill again. For Dennis Rader, the Otero murders represented a watershed moment in his life. After years of fantasizing about such acts, he had finally crossed the line into reality and discovered that the experience was everything he had imagined it would be. The sense of absolute power he had felt while controlling his victims' lives and deaths was intoxicating. The fear in their eyes as they realized what was happening, the way their bodies responded to his ropes and ligatures, the final moments when life left their eyes, all of it had exceeded his expectations. In the days following the murders, Rader returned to his normal routine with remarkable composure. He went to work at Coleman Company, attended church with his wife and infant son, and participated in community activities as if nothing had happened. To his co-workers, neighbors, and even his wife, he appeared completely normal. Only Rader himself knew the truth, that he had discovered his true calling as a killer. The psychological impact of successfully carrying out his first murders cannot be overstated. For someone with Rader's personality structure, the experience validated his sense of superiority and confirmed his belief that he was capable of extraordinary things. He had planned and executed a complex crime without being caught or even suspected. In his mind, this made him special, different from ordinary people who lived conventional lives without ever testing their limits or achieving true greatness. However, the immediate aftermath of the Otero murders also presented Rader with new challenges. The intense police investigation that followed meant he had to be extremely careful not to do anything that might draw attention to himself. He studied newspaper coverage of the case obsessively, learning how the investigation was progressing and what evidence the police had discovered. He was both thrilled by the attention his crimes had generated and frustrated that he could not claim credit for his work. As winter turned to spring in 1974, Rader began planning his next attack. The success of the Otero murders had only intensified his desire to kill again, but he understood that he needed to be more careful about victim selection and execution. He resumed his trolling activities, spending hours driving around Wichita looking for suitable targets. His criteria were specific. He preferred women who lived alone or with minimal security, people whose disappearance might not be noticed immediately. On April 4th, 1974, less than 3 months after the Otero murders, Rader targeted 21-year-old Catherine Bright, who worked at Coleman Company alongside him. He had been watching Catherine for weeks, learning her routines and planning his approach. She lived with her 19-year-old brother Kevin in a house near Wichita State University, a location that provided both opportunity and challenge for Rader's plans. That afternoon, Rader broke into the Bright home through a sliding glass door, planning to wait for Catherine to return from work. However, his preparations were interrupted when his gun accidentally discharged, creating evidence of his presence and adding an element of unpredictability to his carefully laid plans. When Catherine arrived home with her brother Kevin, Rader was forced to improvise, confronting both siblings with his weapon. Using the same deception he had employed with the Otero family, Rader told the Bright siblings that he was a wanted man who needed money and transportation. He forced them into a bedroom and began the process of restraining them, using bandanas and other household items instead of the rope he had brought with him. His goal was to make this crime appear different from the Otero murders, hoping to throw off investigators who might otherwise connect the two cases. However, the presence of Kevin Bright complicated Rader's plans significantly. While he had successfully controlled the Otero family through fear and systematic restraint, Kevin proved to be more resistant. After Rader separated the siblings and began focusing on Catherine, Kevin managed to free himself from his bonds and attempted to escape. This led to a violent struggle during which Rader shot Kevin 3 times, wounds that should have been fatal but somehow left the young man conscious and fighting for his life. Meanwhile, in another room, Catherine Bright was fighting her own desperate battle for survival. When she heard the gunshots and realized what was happening to her brother, she began struggling against her restraints with desperate strength. Rader found that he could not strangle her as easily as he had his previous victims. Her resistance was fierce and prolonged, forcing him to abandon his preferred method of killing and resort to multiple stab wounds to finally end her life. The chaos of the Bright attack was unlike anything Rader had experienced during the Otero murders. Instead of the calm, controlled environment he had created at the first crime scene, he found himself dealing with 2 fighting victims, accidental gunshots, and the very real possibility of discovery. When Kevin Bright managed to escape from the house and run for help, Rader was forced to flee without completing all of his usual post-murder rituals. Despite the complications, Rader considered the Bright attack a success in many ways. He had killed again, proving to himself that the Otero murders were not just a one-time aberration but the beginning of a new phase in his life. The fact that Kevin Bright had survived to provide a description to police added an element of danger that Rader found exciting rather than concerning. In his twisted psychology, the increased risk only made his crimes more thrilling and significant. The survival of Kevin Bright provided police with their first direct witness to the BTK killer's methods and appearance. Kevin described his attacker as a white male of medium build, approximately 30 years old, wearing glasses and appearing nervous but determined. This description would prove remarkably accurate, but it was not specific enough to lead investigators to Dennis Rader among Wichita's population of hundreds of thousands. More importantly for the investigation, the Bright attack had left behind significant physical evidence that connected it to the Otero murders. The use of restraints, the apparent sexual motivation, and the killer's calm demeanor all suggested that the same perpetrator was responsible for both crimes. Police realized they were dealing with a serial killer who was likely to strike again, but they had no idea when or where the next attack might occur. For several months after the Bright murders, Wichita remained on edge as police searched for leads and residents wondered if they might be the killer's next target. However, Dennis Rader was taking a temporary break from active killing, focusing instead on perfecting his techniques and savoring the memories of his first two successful attacks. He spent hours reviewing newspaper coverage of both crimes, studying police statements and witness descriptions to learn how his methods could be improved. During this period, Rader also began developing what would become another signature aspect of his crimes: communication with authorities and the media. He was frustrated that no one knew he was responsible for both the Otero and Bright murders, and he wanted recognition for his work. The idea of taunting police with letters and phone calls appealed to his narcissistic personality and his desire to be seen as superior to ordinary criminals. In October 1974, Rader took the step that would define his public identity for the next 30 years. He wrote a letter describing the Otero murders in detail and left it inside a book at the Wichita Public Library, where he knew it would eventually be discovered. The letter was filled with misspellings and unusual phrasings, but its content was unmistakably authentic. Most significantly, the letter introduced the nickname that would strike fear into the hearts of Wichita residents for decades: BTK. In the letter, Rader explained that BTK stood for bind them, torture them, kill them, a description of his preferred method of murdering victims. He wrote about the Otero family murders with a tone of pride and accomplishment, describing details that only the killer could have known. He also made it clear that he intended to kill again, writing that the code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. The discovery of this letter marked the beginning of BTK's public persona as one of America's most notorious serial killers. However, the man behind the letter continued to live his seemingly normal life in Park City, Kansas. Dennis Rader went to work each day, attended church with his family, and participated in community activities while secretly reveling in the fear and attention his crimes had generated. As 1974 came to an end, Rader was already planning his next attack. The success of his first two murders had confirmed his belief that he was destined for something greater than the ordinary life he appeared to be living. He saw himself as superior to other people, someone capable of acts that most humans could never contemplate. This grandiose self-image would drive him to continue killing for the next 17 years, always seeking new ways to perfect his craft and achieve recognition for his work. The year 1975 passed without any additional BTK murders, but Rader was far from inactive. He used this time to refine his methods, study potential victims, and develop his communication strategy with authorities. He also began experiencing the first of what would become regular cooling-off periods, intervals between murders that allowed him to process his experiences and plan for future attacks. These periods were not signs of remorse or hesitation, but rather calculated pauses that helped him avoid detection while building anticipation for his next crime. During this time, Rader's personal life continued to evolve in ways that provided additional cover for his criminal activities. He left his job at Coleman Company and began working for ADT Security Services, a company that installed home security systems throughout the Wichita area. This new position was almost perfectly suited to his needs as a serial killer. It gave him legitimate reasons to visit homes throughout the city, learn about security systems, and identify potential victims who lived alone or in vulnerable situations. The irony of a serial killer working for a home security company was not lost on Rader himself. He took a perverse pleasure in the fact that he was paid to protect people from exactly the kind of crimes he was committing. Some of the security systems he installed were for families who feared they might become BTK's next victims, never knowing that the very man they were trying to keep out was the one installing their alarms and learning their vulnerabilities. Rader's work at ADT also provided him with technical knowledge that enhanced his criminal capabilities. He learned about different types of locks, alarm systems, and security measures, information that helped him plan more effective break-ins. He also gained insights into police procedures and investigation techniques through his interactions with law enforcement officers who consulted with ADT about security matters. In early 1977, after more than 2 years of planning and preparation, Rader felt ready to resume his killing activities. He had identified several potential victims during his trolling activities and had developed what he believed were improved techniques for controlling and killing his targets. Most importantly, he had refined his post-murder communication strategy, planning to send additional letters that would cement his reputation as BTK. On March 17, 1977, Rader struck again, targeting 24-year-old Shirley Vian, a single mother who lived with her 3 young children in a small house in Wichita. Shirley had been working as a secretary to support her family, and her daily routines had made her an ideal target for Rader's methodical approach to victim selection. He had been watching her for weeks, learning when she was most vulnerable and how he could gain access to her home. That morning, Rader knocked on Shirley's door and told her that he was investigating reports of a prowler in the neighborhood. This ruse allowed him to gain entry to her home without forcing his way in, maintaining the calm control he preferred during his attacks. Once inside, he revealed his true intentions and began the process of restraining Shirley while her children watched in terror. The presence of Shirley's children created an additional psychological challenge for Rader, but he had anticipated this situation and developed a plan to deal with it. He locked the 3 children in a bathroom, telling them to stay quiet and promising that their mother would be fine if they cooperated. This allowed him to focus his attention on Shirley without the distraction of crying or screaming children. Rader strangled Shirley Vian with a rope, taking his time to ensure that she experienced maximum terror before dying. Unlike his previous victims, Shirley was not immediately killed but was allowed to regain consciousness multiple times during the strangulation process, creating a prolonged period of suffering that satisfied Rader's psychological needs. After she was dead, he positioned her body in a sexually suggestive pose and masturbated over her, following the same ritual he had established with his previous victims. Before leaving the Vian home, Rader took time to comfort the children he had locked in the bathroom, telling them that their mother was sleeping and that they should wait before coming out. This display of false concern for the children he had just orphaned revealed another disturbing aspect of his personality: the ability to switch between extreme cruelty and apparent kindness without any genuine emotional connection to his victims or their families. The murder of Shirley Vian represented a refinement of Rader's killing techniques and demonstrated his growing confidence as a serial killer. He had successfully controlled multiple potential witnesses, carried out his crime without detection, and left behind minimal evidence that could lead to his identification. The fact that he had managed to kill a mother while her children were in the same house showed a level of callousness that shocked even experienced investigators. Just 8 months later, on December 8, 1977, BTK struck again. This time his target was 25-year-old Nancy Fox, a secretary who lived alone in a small apartment in Wichita. Nancy represented the type of victim Rader preferred: a single woman who lived independently with minimal security measures. He had been watching her for several weeks, learning her daily routines and identifying the best time and method for his attack. Rader gained entry to Nancy's apartment by breaking in through a back window while she was at work. He waited inside for several hours, making himself comfortable and preparing his kill kit while anticipating her return. When Nancy arrived home that evening, she found Rader waiting for her, and he immediately took control of the situation using the techniques he had perfected through his previous crimes. Unlike some of his earlier victims, Nancy Fox was able to engage Rader in conversation before her death. She asked him what he wanted and why he was doing this to her. Rader told her that he had sexual problems and that he needed to act out certain fantasies to satisfy his psychological needs. This conversation revealed another aspect of Rader's personality: his belief that his actions were somehow justified by his psychological compulsions. Rader forced Nancy to undress and then handcuffed her before strangling her with her own belt. He took his time with the killing, alternately tightening and loosening the ligature to prolong her suffering and increase his own psychological satisfaction. After she was dead, he removed the handcuffs and masturbated over her body, following his established post-murder ritual. The Nancy Fox murder was particularly significant because it demonstrated Rader's growing boldness and his desire for increased attention. After killing Nancy, he actually called the police department to report the crime, directing them to her apartment and providing details that only the killer could have known. This phone call was recorded and later used as evidence, but at the time it served Rader's primary purpose of ensuring that his crime would receive immediate attention and media coverage. Following the Fox murder, Rader entered another extended cooling-off period that would last for nearly 8 years. However, this hiatus did not mean he was inactive. He continued his trolling activities, identifying potential victims and planning future attacks. He also maintained his communications with authorities and the media, sending additional letters that provided more details about his crimes and his psychological motivations. During this period, Rader's personal life continued to evolve in ways that provided additional cover for his criminal activities. In 1978, his wife Paula gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Carrie. Becoming the father of a daughter added new dimensions to Rader's double life, as he was now responsible for protecting and nurturing a young girl, while simultaneously fantasizing about torturing and killing other people's daughters. The birth of Carrie also provided Rader with new insights into the psychology of his victims' families. As he watched his own daughter grow and develop, he gained a deeper understanding of the pain his crimes caused to the families of his victims. However, this understanding did not lead to remorse or a desire to stop killing. Instead, it seemed to enhance his sense of power and control, knowing that he could destroy other families while protecting his own. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Rader continued to build his reputation as a respectable member of the Park City community. He became increasingly active in his Lutheran church, eventually serving on the church council and taking on leadership responsibilities. He also became involved in the Boy Scouts, serving as a troop leader and organizing camping trips and other activities for young people in the community. These community activities served multiple purposes for Rader. First, they provided him with additional cover for his true nature, making it even more unlikely that anyone would suspect him of being BTK. Second, they satisfied his need for recognition and authority, allowing him to exercise control over others in socially acceptable ways. Finally, they gave him opportunities to study potential victims and their families, gathering information that could be useful for future crimes. In 1979, Rader graduated from Wichita State University with a degree in criminal justice, a choice of major that reflected his fascination with law enforcement and his desire to understand how investigations were conducted. His studies gave him insights into police procedures, forensic techniques, and criminal psychology that he used to improve his own methods and avoid detection. The degree also enhanced his credibility as a respectable community member and provided him with additional career opportunities. After graduating from college, Rader transitioned from his job at ADT Security Services to a position with the city government of Park City, where he worked as a compliance officer. This new job gave him official authority to enter people's homes and businesses to investigate code violations, issue citations, and enforce city ordinances. It was a perfect position for someone who enjoyed exercising power over others and who needed legitimate reasons to study potential victims' living situations. As a compliance officer, Rader was known for being extremely strict and sometimes overzealous in enforcing city regulations. Neighbors and business owners often complained about his rigid interpretation of rules and his apparent enjoyment of issuing citations and fines. Some residents found him intimidating and unnecessarily harsh, but these complaints were generally dismissed as the natural reaction of people who disliked being told to follow the rules. The job also allowed Rader to satisfy some of his control and dominance needs through legal means, which may have contributed to the extended cooling-off period between the Nancy Fox murder in 1977 and his next killing in 1985. During this time, he was able to exercise authority over people enter their homes, and make them comply with his demands without having to resort to murder. This legal outlet for his controlling behavior helped him maintain his facade while planning for future crimes. However, as the years passed, Rader began to feel the urge to kill again. The satisfaction he derived from his compliance officer work was not sufficient to replace the intense psychological gratification he had experienced during his murders. He began to increase his trolling activities, spending more time driving around Wichita and the surrounding areas to identify potential victims and study their vulnerabilities. On April 27, 1985, nearly 8 years after his last murder, BTK struck again. This time his target was 53-year-old Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just 6 houses away from Rader's own home in Park City. The choice of Maureen as a victim represented a significant escalation in Rader's boldness, as killing someone so close to his own residence greatly increased the risk of detection. Maureen Hedge was a widow who lived alone in a modest home on the same street where Rader lived with his wife and 2 children. She was known in the neighborhood as a friendly, quiet woman who kept to herself and posed no threat to anyone. For Rader, she represented an ideal victim, accessible, vulnerable, and unlikely to be missed immediately if she disappeared. The murder of Maureen Hedge followed Rader's established pattern in most respects. He broke into her home late at night, surprised her while she was sleeping, and used his standard techniques to restrain and kill her. However, this murder also included several new elements that demonstrated the evolution of his methods and his growing confidence as a serial killer. After killing Maureen, Rader took the unprecedented step of moving her body from her home to his church, Christ Lutheran, where he served on the council. Using his keys to the building, he brought Maureen's body into the church and spent several hours photographing her in various bondage positions, using the sacred space for his profane activities. This act represented the ultimate expression of his contempt for the moral and social institutions that defined normal society. The photographs Rader took of Maureen Hedge's body in the church revealed another disturbing aspect of his psychology: the need to document and preserve his crimes for future reference. These images became part of his private collection of trophies, along with items stolen from his victims and detailed written accounts of his methods. He would later use these materials to relive his crimes during periods when he was not actively killing. After completing his photographic session, Rader moved Maureen's body once more, this time to a wooded area outside of town where it would not be discovered immediately. He then returned home and resumed his normal routine, going to work the next day and attending church services that weekend as if nothing had happened. The body was not found for several days, and when it was discovered, investigators initially did not connect it to the BTK killings. The Maureen Hedge murder represented several firsts for Rader that demonstrated his evolution as a serial killer. It was the first time he had killed someone from his own neighborhood, the first time he had moved a body after the murder, and the first time he had used a church as part of his crime scene. These innovations showed his growing confidence and his desire to push the boundaries of his criminal activities. On September 16, 1986, just over a year after killing Maureen Hedge, Rader struck again. His victim this time was 28-year-old Vicki Weggerl, a young mother who lived with her husband and 2-year-old son in Wichita. The choice of Vicki as a victim represented another escalation, as she was a married woman living in a family home rather than a single woman living alone. Rader gained access to the Weggerl home by posing as a telephone repairman, using his knowledge of utility systems to create a convincing cover story. When Vicki answered the door, he showed her fake identification and told her that he needed to check the phone lines inside her house. This ruse allowed him to enter the home without raising suspicion or alerting neighbors to his presence. Once inside the Weggerl home, Rader waited until Vicki was distracted before revealing his true intentions. He attacked her while her young son was playing in another room, restraining her and beginning the process of torture and murder that had become his signature. However, Vicki Weggerl proved to be one of his most resistant victims, fighting desperately for her life and the life of her child. The struggle with Vicki was prolonged and violent, with Rader ultimately strangling her with rope while her 2-year-old son remained in the house. After she was dead, he positioned her body and took photographs, following his established ritual. However, the presence of the child created additional complications that required him to adjust his usual post-murder procedures. Before leaving the Weggerl home, Rader was careful to ensure that the 2-year-old boy would be safe until other family members arrived. This concern for the child's welfare was not born of genuine compassion, but rather of practical considerations. A dead child would have created additional investigative complications and might have led to evidence that could identify him as the killer. The Vicky Wegerle murder was initially not connected to the other BTK killings by investigators. The long gap between crimes and some differences in methodology led police to classify it as a separate case. This misclassification served Rader's purposes perfectly, as it meant that the full extent of his activities remained hidden from public view and law enforcement analysis. On January 19, 1991, Dennis Rader committed what would prove to be his final murder. His victim was 62-year-old Dolores Davis, a grandmother who lived alone in a rural area outside Park City. Dolores represented the type of isolated, vulnerable victim that Rader had always preferred, but the location and circumstances of her murder showed that he was taking increasingly dangerous risks in pursuit of his psychological needs. The murder of Dolores Davis occurred during a Boy Scout camping trip that Rader was leading, demonstrating the extent to which he had integrated his criminal activities with his legitimate community responsibilities. He used the camping trip as cover for his absence from home, telling his wife and family that he would be away overnight with the scouts while actually committing murder. Rader broke into Dolores Davis's home by throwing a concrete block through her sliding glass door, abandoning the subtle approach he had used in previous crimes. This change in methodology suggested that his need to kill was becoming more urgent and less controlled, leading him to accept greater risks in order to satisfy his psychological compulsions. After restraining and strangling Dolores in her home, Rader moved her body to his car and drove to a remote location where he dumped it under a bridge. This was only the second time he had moved a victim's body after the murder, and it showed his continued evolution as a killer. However, it also created additional evidence and opportunities for detection that would later contribute to his identification. The Dolores Davis murder marked the end of Dennis Rader's active killing phase, though this was not apparent to investigators or the public at the time. For reasons that remain unclear, Rader stopped killing after 1991 and entered what would prove to be a permanent cooling-off period. Various theories have been proposed for this cessation of activity, including the possibility that he was satisfied with his accomplishments or that changing life circumstances made continued killing too risky. During the 13 years following the Davis murder, Rader continued to live his double life as a respected community member and secret serial killer. He maintained his position as a city compliance officer, continued his involvement with the Lutheran Church, and served as a Boy Scout leader. To all outward appearances, he was a model citizen who contributed positively to his community and lived according to strong moral values. However, beneath this facade, Rader was struggling with his identity and his place in history. The passage of time had diminished the attention paid to the BTK killings, and new crimes and criminals had captured the public's attention. Rader felt that his accomplishments were being forgotten, and that he was not receiving the recognition he deserved for his work as a serial killer. This need for recognition and attention would ultimately prove to be Rader's undoing. In 2004, 13 years after his last murder, he decided to resume communication with authorities and the media. His goal was to remind the world of BTK's existence and to claim credit for additional crimes that had not been properly attributed to him. This decision to break his silence would lead directly to his arrest and the end of one of the longest unsolved serial killer cases in American history. The BTK case had remained active throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, with investigators periodically reviewing evidence and pursuing new leads. However, the lack of recent crimes and communication from the killer had led many to believe that BTK was either dead or incarcerated for other crimes. The case had become a cold case in all but name, with resources increasingly directed toward more recent investigations. In March 2004, Rader sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper that contained photographs and other evidence related to the 1986 murder of Vicky Wegerle. This communication served multiple purposes for Rader. It announced BTK's return to public attention. It claimed credit for a murder that had not been officially attributed to him, and it demonstrated that he still possessed detailed evidence from his crimes. The letter immediately reignited public interest in the BTK case and prompted a renewed investigative effort by the Wichita Police Department. A special task force was formed to handle the investigation, drawing on the expertise of federal agents, state investigators, and local detectives who had worked on the original cases. The renewed attention was exactly what Rader had hoped to achieve, but it also set in motion the events that would lead to his capture. Over the following months, Rader sent additional letters and packages to various media outlets and law enforcement agencies. Each communication contained new details about his crimes and his psychological motivations, written in the same distinctive style that had characterized his earlier letters. He also began providing information about his personal interests and background, apparently believing that he could control what investigators learned about him while still gaining the recognition he craved. The investigative team used sophisticated forensic techniques to analyze each communication from BTK, looking for clues that might reveal his identity or location. They studied the paper, ink, handwriting, and even the DNA from saliva on stamps and envelopes. However, Rader was careful to avoid leaving obvious evidence that could be traced back to him, using generic materials and taking precautions to minimize his forensic signature. In one particularly revealing communication, Rader asked investigators whether it would be safe for him to communicate using a computer floppy disk, specifically asking if such a disk could be traced back to him. The investigators, hoping to encourage continued communication that might provide additional clues, assured him that a floppy disk would be safe and untraceable. This response was deliberately misleading, as investigators knew that computer disks could contain metadata that might lead to their source. On February 16, 2005, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to Cake Television Station in Wichita. The disk contained a document with his usual taunting messages and claims of responsibility for various crimes. However, Rader had made a crucial mistake in preparing this communication. The disk contained deleted files that revealed information about its origins, including details that would lead investigators directly to him. When forensic computer specialists analyzed the floppy disk, they discovered that it had been used at Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, where Rader served as congregation president. More specifically, they found that the disk had been used by someone named Dennis to create and edit church documents. This information, combined with other intelligence gathered during the investigation, led investigators to focus their attention on Dennis Rader. The discovery of the church connection was the breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for throughout the 30-year investigation. Within days of analyzing the floppy disk, they had identified Rader as their prime suspect and begun surveillance of his activities. They also began gathering additional evidence that could be used to confirm his identity as BTK and support criminal charges. One crucial piece of additional evidence was DNA material that could be compared to samples recovered from BTK crime scenes. However, investigators could not simply approach Rader and request a DNA sample without alerting him to their suspicions and possibly prompting him to flee or destroy evidence. Instead, they needed to obtain a sample surreptitiously that could be used for comparison purposes. The solution came through Rader's daughter, Carrie, who had recently visited a medical clinic for a routine gynecological examination. Investigators obtained a court order allowing them to access the tissue sample from her medical procedure, which they then used to perform familial DNA analysis. The results showed a strong match between the DNA profile from BTK crime scenes and Carrie Rader's genetic profile, confirming that her father was indeed the killer they had been seeking. On February 25, 2005, 31 years after the first BTK murders, Dennis Rader was arrested at his workplace in Park City. The arrest was conducted quietly and professionally, with investigators taking care to avoid creating a scene that might alert media or bystanders to what was happening. Rader was surprised by the arrest, but offered no resistance, apparently recognizing that his long run as an undetected serial killer had finally come to an end. When investigators informed Rader that they knew he was BTK, his reaction was remarkably calm and matter-of-fact. Rather than denying the charges or expressing remorse for his crimes, he seemed almost relieved that his secret identity had been discovered. During subsequent interrogations, he provided detailed confessions to all 10 murders and offered insights into his methods and psychological motivations. The arrest of Dennis Rader sent shockwaves through the Wichita community and the nation. The revelation that BTK had been hiding in plain sight for 3 decades, serving as a church leader and city employee while secretly being one of America's most notorious serial killers, challenged assumptions about how such criminals could be identified and caught. The case became a textbook example of how serial killers could successfully integrate into normal society while pursuing their deadly activities. For Rader's family, the arrest was devastating in ways that are difficult to comprehend. His wife, Paula, who had been married to him for 34 years, learned that the man she had loved and lived with was responsible for terrorizing their entire community. Their children, Brian and Carrie, discovered that their father, whom they had admired and trusted, was one of the most evil men in American criminal history. The psychological impact on Rader's family cannot be overstated. They had not only lost their husband and father to the criminal justice system, but they had also learned that their entire lives had been built on a foundation of lies and deception. Every family memory, every shared experience, every moment of apparent love and affection was now tainted by the knowledge of what Dennis Rader truly was. Paula Rader immediately filed for divorce, seeking to distance herself and her children from the man who had deceived them so completely. She refused to visit him in jail or to maintain any contact with him, cutting all ties to the person she had thought she knew. Her priority became protecting her children and helping them cope with the devastating revelations about their father. The community reaction to Rader's arrest was similarly complex and intense. Many residents expressed relief that the BTK Killer had finally been caught and could no longer threaten their safety. However, there was also a sense of betrayal and violation, knowing that the very person who had been enforcing city ordinances and serving in church leadership had been the source of their decades-long fear. On June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader appeared in court to enter a plea on 10 counts of first-degree murder. In a decision that surprised many observers, he chose to plead guilty to all charges rather than face a jury trial. This plea allowed him to provide detailed descriptions of each murder, speaking about his crimes with the same calm, matter-of-fact tone that had characterized his communications with investigators. During his plea hearing, Rader described each murder in clinical detail, explaining his methods and motivations without showing any apparent remorse or emotional connection to his victims. He spoke about binding, torturing, and killing 10 human beings as if he were describing routine work procedures, displaying the same psychological detachment that had allowed him to commit the crimes in the first place. The court proceeding was extremely difficult for the victims' family members, who were forced to listen as Rader methodically described how he had killed their loved ones. Many family members left the courtroom during his testimony, unable to bear hearing the details of their relatives' final moments. Those who remained showed remarkable strength and dignity in the face of unimaginable pain. Rader's decision to plead guilty and provide detailed confessions served several purposes from his perspective. First, it allowed him to maintain control over the narrative of his crimes, ensuring that his version of events would be part of the official record. Second, it gave him the opportunity to receive the recognition and attention he had always craved, with his words being broadcast to a national audience and recorded for posterity. On August 18, 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison, without the possibility of parole. The sentence represented the harshest punishment available under Kansas law, as the state did not have the death penalty during the time period when Rader's crimes were committed. The judge's sentencing meant that Rader would spend the rest of his life in prison, with no possibility of early release or parole. Before imposing sentence, the judge allowed family members of Rader's victims to make impact statements describing how his crimes had affected their lives. These statements were powerful and emotional, providing a stark contrast to Rader's cold recitation of his methods during the plea hearing. Family members spoke about the decades of pain, fear, and loss they had experienced because of his actions. In his own statement before sentencing, Rader offered what appeared to be an apology to the victims' families, but his words lacked genuine emotion or remorse. He spoke about being taken over by a dark side and expressed hope that someday God would forgive him for his actions. However, his tone and demeanor suggested that he was more concerned about his own fate than about the pain he had caused others. Following his sentencing, Dennis Rader was transported to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he began serving his life sentences. The prison is a maximum security institution that houses some of the state's most dangerous criminals, including several other convicted murderers and serial killers. Rader was placed in protective custody initially, both for his own safety and because of the high-profile nature of his crimes. Life in prison represented a dramatic change for someone who had spent 30 years successfully hiding his true nature behind a facade of respectability and community involvement. Instead of being recognized as a church leader and city official, Rader was now known primarily as BTK, one of America's most notorious serial killers. The attention he received was no longer based on his legitimate accomplishments, but solely on his criminal notoriety. The prison environment also deprived Rader of the control and authority he had exercised throughout his adult life. Instead of being able to dominate others through his official positions or his crimes, he was now subject to the rules and schedules imposed by correctional officers. This loss of control represented a fundamental challenge to his psychological makeup and his sense of identity. However, Rader adapted to prison life with the same methodical approach he had applied to his crimes and his legitimate career. He established routines, followed regulations, and avoided conflicts with other inmates or staff members. His behavior was generally described as compliant and unremarkable, suggesting that he had accepted his situation and was not planning escape attempts or other disruptive activities. During his incarceration, Rader has maintained correspondence with various people outside the prison, including family members, researchers, and individuals interested in his crimes. These letters have provided additional insights into his personality and his perspective on his actions. However, they have also revealed his continued lack of genuine remorse and his ongoing narcissistic focus on his own importance and achievements. Some of Rader's prison correspondence has focused on his desire to be remembered as a significant figure in criminal history, comparable to other famous serial killers like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. He has expressed frustration when he feels that his crimes are being forgotten or overshadowed by other cases, revealing his continued need for recognition and attention even while serving life sentences. The case of Dennis Rader has had lasting impacts on law enforcement practices, criminal psychology research, and public understanding of serial killers. His ability to remain undetected for 30 years while living as a seemingly normal community member challenged many assumptions about how such criminals could be identified and apprehended. The case demonstrated the importance of advanced forensic techniques and the potential for technology to solve cold cases that had seemed hopeless. The BTK investigation also highlighted the psychological complexity of serial killers and the difficulty of creating accurate profiles based on crime scene evidence alone. Many of the assumptions investigators had made about BTK's personality, lifestyle, and background proved to be incorrect, leading to revisions in profiling techniques and investigative approaches. For the mental health community, the Rader case provided valuable insights into the psychology of serial killers and the ways in which such individuals can compartmentalize their lives to maintain normal social functioning while committing horrific crimes. His case has been studied extensively by researchers interested in understanding the development and expression of psychopathic personality disorders. The impact on the Wichita community has been profound and lasting. The resolution of the BTK case brought relief to residents who had lived in fear for decades, but it also forced the community to confront the reality that evil can hide behind the most ordinary and respectable facades. The case became a part of local history and identity, remembered both for the terror it caused and for the persistence of investigators who never gave up seeking justice. Today, more than 20 years after his arrest, Dennis Rader remains incarcerated at El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he continues to serve his 10 consecutive life sentences. He is now in his late 70s, and reports suggest that he is experiencing health problems related to aging and the stress of long-term incarceration. However, he continues to maintain his innocence regarding any crimes beyond the 10 murders for which he was convicted. Recent years have seen renewed interest in the BTK case, partly due to investigators' efforts to determine whether Rader might have been responsible for additional unsolved crimes in Kansas and surrounding states. Cold case detectives have been reviewing unsolved murders and disappearances from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, looking for connections to Rader's known methods and timeline. Some of these investigations have focused on cases in Oklahoma and Missouri, where authorities believe Rader may have committed additional murders that were never connected to the BTK series. These investigations have involved searching properties once owned by Rader and conducting new forensic analyses of evidence from cold cases. However, None of these investigations have yet resulted in additional charges against Rader. The story of Dennis Rader serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary and respectable appearances. For 30 years, he successfully maintained a double life, presenting himself as a model citizen while secretly being one of America's most dangerous serial killers. His case demonstrates the importance of persistent investigation, advanced forensic techniques, and the recognition that monsters can live among us without detection for decades. The victims of Dennis Rader, Joseph, Julie, Josephine, and Joseph Jr. Otero, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Weggerl, and Dolores Davis, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individual human beings whose lives were cut short by unspeakable evil. Their families and friends continue to deal with the lasting impact of these crimes, carrying the pain and loss with them while working to honor the memories of their loved ones. The BTK case also highlights the resilience of communities faced with terror and uncertainty. Despite decades of fear and the shocking revelation of the killer's true identity, Wichita has continued to grow and thrive. The case has become part of the city's history, but it does not define the community's character or future. As Dennis Rader continues to serve his life sentences in prison, the full impact of his crimes continues to reverberate through the lives of those he affected. The families of his victims carry permanent scars from his actions, while the community he terrorized has had to come to terms with the reality that the person they trusted as a leader and protector was actually their greatest threat. The story of BTK remains one of the most disturbing and complex cases in American criminal history, a reminder that human evil can take forms that are both horrific and surprisingly ordinary. It serves as a testament to the importance of justice, the power of persistence in investigation, and the need to remember and honor the victims of violent crime while working to prevent such tragedies in the future. The case files are closed, the killer is behind bars, and the community has moved forward, but the story of Dennis Rader and his 30-year reign of terror will continue to be studied and remembered as long as people seek to understand the darkest aspects of human